Lord be with you, and the Lord is risen. Alleluia, alleluia. Today is Friday of the fourth week of Easter, and our reflections yesterday and today and tomorrow are all going to be on the mission that the church has in proclaiming the risen Christ. We saw yesterday in the Acts of the Apostles that book, by about the 12th or 13th chapter, moves away from the preaching of St. Peter to the missionary journeys of St. Paul. We know that my guest yesterday was St. Paul, and he was one who began what is our three missionary journeys that take him throughout Asia Minor, take him over to Europe, into Greece, over to Cyprus. His mission was to go to the ends of the earth. In fact, he was on his way to Spain when he was martyred in Rome, so he never was able to get to the furthest edge of the world. I mentioned yesterday Paul VI, who took the name Paul because he too wanted to be a missionary. I mentioned at the end of my conference yesterday that the little flower St. Therese wanted to be a missionary and was in fact named patron of the missions, even though she never left her convent. So all of us have a part to play in the mission life of the church. After the brief pontificate of Pope John Paul I, who recently has had a committee set up to study whether he might be considered a saint, even though he was only Pope for about 30 days, following him was the great Saint John Paul II, who was Pope from 1978 to 2005. Now, if there's anything we know about John Paul, who took the name, of course, from John the 23rd, his predecessor before him, and Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II. And that spirit of missionary activity that so marked the life of St. Paul and enlivened the ministry of Paul VI was certainly embraced by John Paul II. We know that he made over 104 foreign trips. He traveled 725,000 miles. That sounds correct, I think. 750,000 miles in spreading the gospel. And we know that he came to the United States. I remember going to Washington to see him, also to Philadelphia when he came. And he just brought out the huge crowds of people that were anxious to see him. I remember seeing a button when we went to Washington, and it just said, with a picture of Pope Francis, "I got a peek at the Pope." And that was as close as I ever was to the Pope at that time. So he saw the importance of missionary journeys, just like Paul the Apostle, just like his predecessor Paul VI. John Paul II, not only was he a world traveler, and like Paul VI was also nicknamed the Pilgrim Pope, in addition to all of the travel that he did in preaching to millions of people, he was also one who, like Paul the Apostle, was one who wrote letters. We've had a long tradition in the papacy of writing encyclicals. An encyclical basically is a letter to the church, a letter explaining different doctrines of the church and helping faithful Christians understand more deeply the mystery of the church. John Paul II wrote well over a dozen encyclicals covering such topics as the Eucharist, the Gospel of Life, which has been such an important foundation document in our approach to the seamless garment of respect for human life. He wrote a document on work, and also one on Mary, who is the mother of the Redeemer. He was also one who was, in the spirit of Paul VI, very interested in ecumenical activities. We know that Paul VI, one of his first journeys was to Jerusalem, where he met with the Apostolic Ecumenical Patriarch, who represented all of the Eastern churches. That ecumenical step that Paul VI took, that journey toward unity with the other churches was carried forth by John Paul II when he too met with the ecumenical patriarch. And in that meeting he assured the Eastern churches, those who are Orthodox and those who are Catholic, that we are one faith. He uses the image of a bird has two wings. And for the church we have the Western traditions and the Eastern traditions. And the desire for Christian unity is so evident in John Paul II. In fact, his important document, his encyclical, was on the commitment that he makes and the church makes to ecumenism, to find our way to one another, to find our way in union with Christ. John Paul II, of course, was shot while in office, almost died, shot in Vatican Square, but went on from that accident, that shooting, that attempt on his life, to continue his ministry. And we remember John Paul, the vigorous apostle, but we also remember John Paul at the end of his life, where we could see how Parkinson's disease was really debilitating him, but he took the commitment to follow Christ, the suffering Christ, to the very end of his life. And so we continue today to think about the missionary work, whether it is travel, whether it's writing letters. Certainly the teacher of Rome, be it Paul VI or John Paul II, is one whose ministry is to spread the gospel, because they recognize that they too are sent as Christ was sent. May God bless you and your loved ones on this Friday of the fourth week of Easter. I look forward to being with you tomorrow when we will speak further about the travels of our Holy Fathers.